Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Happy 4th of July to all the Americans listening to this, which is the majority of you. Thank you very much for your wonderful support and for your fine country. I thought this would be a good day to launch my next project for my subscribers here on the Substack, and that is a book study. I've been talking about wanting to do things like this for a while, and I've got the opportunity to now. And I want to bring you through this book here called They Have Uncrowned Him by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. And I thought it was apropos to launch that today because at the heart of the American Revolution really is the error of liberalism. I'm not saying this to, dump on America or throw shade or anything like that. My country, Canada, has been imbibed with very similar principles as well. And I'm talking about the principles of things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, all of these freedoms. What are these freedoms? What is true freedom? What is a false freedom? What's the difference between sort of permission or tolerance or license? What has the church said on it? There actually is a robust literature on this question. And in this book by Archbishop Lefebvre, he goes over pretty much all those things. And a lot of people don't understand, or maybe they're not aware, and maybe you are because my viewers are very astute with these things. The main thing Archbishop Lefebvre was fighting when it came to tradition, fighting for, I should say, was the traditional kingship, the traditional doctrine of the kingship of Christ. And the Mass is a part of that. And it wasn't as if the Mass was secondary, but the king deserves a kingly Mass. There's something there in the works of Archbishop Lefebvre. And the thing that he was most adamant about doctrinally as an error from the council was religious freedom. And he submitted a whole dubia on that, many hundreds of pages long. That's a whole other conversation for another day, which perhaps we'll get into maybe as we go with this series. But this book, They've Uncrowned Him, goes through the traditional understanding of the kingship of Christ and shows that it really is dogma. It's not just opinion, it's dogma. And how these things have been, well, they've been ignored and, basically error and heresy has become the norm in the church. I mean, recently, a friend of mine was talking about his traditional Latin Mass down in Texas. It was Nick Cavazos he was talking about on our show. And he was saying that it's a traditional Latin Mass, and the priest comes out at this traditional Mass and talks about how Catholics have to fight for freedom of religion and so forth, which is not true. Freedom of religion is technically an error, if not a heresy, which we'll talk about throughout this book study. That may seem strange. You might be thinking to yourself, well, hold on, freedom of religion is a heresy? Well, I have the freedom to worship God. Well, yes, that's true. Only the true God has the right to be worshipped. And therefore, only the right worship in that true sense really does have rights. Other things can be tolerated, but that's not the same thing as a right. That's a toleration. And we'll get into those distinctions as we go through this course. And I want to bring you through this book. And the reason I chose this book is because it's wonderful. Many people call it the Summa of Archbishop Lefebvre, reference to the Summa of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I also chose it because I'll show you where you can get it. You can get a paper copy. You can see here from Angelus Press. If you're in the States, very easy. If you're in Canada, sometimes from Angelus. I am very good friends with the editor of Angelus Press, Jim Vogel, but they have a problem getting things to Canada quickly. I don't know why. The market's not too big enough to have stores here or something, but you can get it online, or your local bookstore might have it if it's an SSPX chapel. But one of the other reasons I chose it is because there's also an audiobook, which is done by the Society of St. Pius X, available for free on their YouTube. You can also listen to it on their podcast platform. So if you look up the SSPX podcast, whatever podcast app you use, I think if you go to sspxpodcast.com, I'm pretty sure, I think you can actually listen to the MP3s there as well. But the point is, it's all over the place for free. And it's a wonderfully produced audiobook with a great narrator, and it's a professional product. So there's no cost associated with this if you just want to get into the book and don't want to buy it. I recommend buying it if you can, but you don't have to. Okay, so this episode will be free for all. Not a free-for-all, but it'll be free for all for those of you who are listening and who are not paid subscribers. But after this episode, when I give this primer on this error of liberalism, from a basic philosophical perspective, I'm not going to go deep into resources or anything like that here. This is just a primer. And then we'll start getting into the book as we go. But this episode will be free for everybody. But if you want to hear the next series of episodes for this book study, you're going to have to sign up. And you can do that by doing so through the Substack. that you're already seeing this through, but just have to upgrade to a paid subscriber. And also, I encourage you, as you're engaging in this book study, as the listeners and viewers, to post comments, questions in the comment sections of the posts. I can't get to every single one, although I do get to a lot, and I'll do my best. But I'll try to address if there are questions of clarity for, I didn't really understand this, Kennedy. In the next one, can you clarify? I'll definitely go through those things, and I'll make sure I do that kind of on air, and we can go through those things together as well. So I'm encouraging you to sign up because the rest of this will be behind a paywall, as they say. Okay, what is liberalism? Well, liberalism is essentially a philosophical current that became commonplace in Protestant Europe. You could say Protestantism as such is liberalism, but if we're being more exact with when the term starts to be thrown around, we start finding this more or less in the era of the revolutions in America and in France. Some resources say they don't really see the word liberalism until the 1800s. Nonetheless, similar terms were used in the times of the revolutions in America and in France. Now, the revolutions in America and in France, they're not the same. The American Revolution is a lot more complicated, and there is a much stronger case to be made for those who want to justify it than the French Revolution. The French Revolution cannot be justified under any circumstances. The reason why the American Revolution could be justified, or someone could attempt to in good faith as a Catholic, even if maybe we don't agree with that, maybe you do, I don't know, but one of the reasons why it could be is because it was also sort of part rebellion. It was part rebellion, part revolution. Also, the ruling class, the English, and I'm very much a fan of England, they themselves were a revolutionary government in the sense that they had revolted against the church. So there was this sort of perpetual state of revolution and usurpation that had been going on. There had been a series of political instabilities in England since the time of the Reformation, and there seems to be more justification for a desire to separate oneself from the crown than there was in France. I'm just trying to give the benefit of the doubt. I personally think it's a pretty strong case against the American Revolution from a Catholic moral perspective. Nonetheless, that would be the case someone would make, and fair enough. The French Revolution, on the other hand, completely unjustifiable. It was a murderous bloodbath. It was an absolute disaster. There was no way. It was a complete overthrow of Catholic France, intentionally so, and it was genocidal and murderous. So, where does this notion of liberalism come from? Well, really, what liberalism is, it's in the word, liberal. The word liberal isn't a bad word in a linguistic sense. You can be liberal with your money. If you read, for example, you can be liberal with your time. Thomas Aquinas talks about the virtue of liberality, meaning basically being generous. The notion that liberalism has, in its best form, if we can say that, is this notion that there should be sort of a maximum amount of liberty, hence the word liberal, for the citizens, and a smaller amount of government control over the individuals. Now, this is something that's perfectly sensible. There are a lot of things that many people who call themselves liberals would say that Catholics would agree with. You also do find, for example, that in the English usage of the word, you have liberals in England in the last century and before who are nothing like what we would consider liberals today, and really, they didn't really hold any of the principles that liberals in America would have. There were liberals in the UK, for example. There was a liberal party. The Manchester Liberals were common. And you had, for example, Hilaire Belloc, who no one would say is a friend of liberalism, but he himself was actually an MP in the Liberal Party. And how could that be? Well, the way the term was used was kind of different. So we have to get to the root of the notion, the notions behind what we would consider liberalism today and what has been condemned by the church. Ultimately, it's placing the rights of man over the rights of God. That's the easiest way to understand it. In the traditional moral structure, the traditional theological and philosophical structure of Christendom, the apex of civilization the height of society, the goal to which we all look, the reason for being and for doing anything, is the honoring and worship of God. John Sr., in his book, The Restoration of Christian Culture, at the very beginning of the book, near the beginning of the book, he says, what is Christendom? And he says, Christendom is the Mass. And he goes on with, first you have an altar. And then because you have an altar, you have to have walls. And because you have walls, you have to have a roof. And because you have to have a priest, you have to have somewhere for the priest to live. And because you have to have somewhere for the priest to live, you have to have people to take care of where the priest lives. And because you have to have a place for the church, you have to have caretakers of the church. And they need somewhere to live, and they need to be fed. So you have to have people with shops and farms and things. It just goes these concentric circles, with the beginning and the middle being Christ and the Mass. And you have these concentric circles coming out and out and out and out and out till you have a Christian civilization. This is why when the Mass crumbles, society crumbles. And this is what we've seen since the Second Vatican Council. It wasn't perfect beforehand, but there was a centrality of the right worship of God, and it was kind of the glue holding things together. And since we've seen the worship of God downgraded, made less majestic, less kingly, less monarchical, less hierarchical, we've seen society crumble at the same time. I don't think it's any coincidence that we see a revolution in the church in the 1960s, and we see consistent revolutions in society beginning in the 1960s with all the various, sexual, political, civil rights, all these kinds of things, right? These things going out and out and out. It's sort of, if we could say in a loose sense, civilization, even though there were problems before the 1960s, but if we could say at least the veneer had this veneer of this appearance that the worship of God was the height of the point of existence. After that, it became the worship of man. And you actually start to see these things in the Second Vatican Council literature. There's a citation, I want to say it's in Gaudium et Spes. We'll go more into this as we go through the show. But you start to see how the glory of God is basically found in man, is the mentality. You see this with the theology of the body, for example. There's some errors in there, which perhaps we might touch on throughout the show, but maybe that's another set of episodes or something like that. You start to see this emphasis on man being the center of existence and God being the servant of man. And there's a half-truth in that, because Christ is the servant, right? He's the humble servant, right? Of course. But nonetheless, he's still the king. So in any event, liberalism establishes the rights of man as primary and the rights of God as secondary. Now, one of the reasons why people might disagree with that, because they'll say, well, hold on, liberalism as a philosophy talks about the freedom of religion, so how can you say God is second? Well, think of it like this. Maybe I'll try to think of an analogy here that works. Well, okay, you have a wife or you have a husband, or you at least understand what that's like. Well, you're married to one woman or you're married to one man, that's your primary and only spouse. If you say, well, we have freedom to be married, and you say, well, there's many wives I'll pick from, is she really the priority in your life? I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but I think you see where I'm going with this, is that there can only be one true spouse, and the church is the mystical body of Christ. We talk about Christ and his bride, the church. Once you get into having multiple brides, you get into a state of fornication, and this is how the Old Testament would talk about what would happen to the Jews, the Hebrews, when they would go off and find these foreign gods. You look at the terminology that's used in the Old Testament, and it's terms like adultery, fornication, and those sorts of things, to talk about idolatry. False religion was compared to fornication and adultery, because this analogy is a prefigurement of the bride of Christ, which is the church, and there's one true bride, because we're not polygamists in the spiritual sense. There's not multiple religions, just like there's not multiple wives. There aren't multiple gods. There's one God, and he has one church that must be established, that has the rights in society, with the true religion, with the right worship, and there can be no compromise. Liberalism stands against all of that. The spirit of the Second Vatican Council that's permeated throughout society and throughout the church since the Second Vatican Council is a very liberal spirit. Liberalism is also very part and parcel with modernism, which perhaps we'll go through as we go through the book. But nonetheless, that's the crux of liberalism. It is the rights of man are the most important thing. And if you think about all the rights that we have in our various constitutions, whether it's the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that I have, or it's the American Constitution, or the various constitutions throughout Europe, or wherever you're from, in Australia or whatever, non-English speaking countries, there will be some deference to God. You know, one nation under God, okay, but which God, and who's his son, and which one is his church? This notion that we're under God, and I know that's not in the Constitution, I think that's in the Pledge of Allegiance. Forgive me if I make mistakes about American civics. But nonetheless, you know, in Canada, we do have, I believe, in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I think the word God is in it. I've read it before. I think the term is God-given or something like that. But really, it's all about man. It's all about man. It's all about you get to worship the way that you want. You get to say whatever you want. You get to print whatever you want. You get to express whatever you want. Well, what about what God wants? What if God's desires, or what if God's will, I should say in the proper sense, he doesn't have changing desires, he's immutable, he's perfect. What if God's will does not correspond with what you want? Well, the liberal society would say, that's not up for us to decide. That's between you and your Bible. That's between you and God. You see how Protestantism plays into this. But this is completely antithetical to Catholicism. Within Catholic society, there's always been a toleration of falsehoods and false ideas and false religions for reasons of keeping the public peace. Thomas Aquinas talks about this, and we'll go through that in the book by Archbishop Lefebvre, the various things. But there's a very big difference between something being tolerated, permitted, allowed, and promoted and given rights. You see, because for something to have a right, or someone to have a right, or some group to have a right, there must be a duty attached to it. Pope Leo XIII talks about this in his encyclical Rerum Novarum about rights and duties. You have a right to work, for example, unless you commit a crime and forfeit your rights, which is possible. But you have a natural right, so to speak. You have a natural, there's a natural principle at work that you have the right to procure what you need for sustenance for your family because you have a duty to provide for them. Okay? You have a right to seek out the right education or to educate your children because you have a duty to make sure they're educated. You can see where we're going with this. All of these true rights have duties attached to them. Everything else is kind of a privilege or permission or a tolerance. And how a society that is Catholic may decide to permit or prohibit certain activities, that's a matter of prudential judgment that's going to be done most effectively through moral coercion and things like that. We don't like these words coercion because they sound so anathema to our liberal spirit. That's something that's going to have to be done. That's a question. If we're going to ask about specifics, you're going to have to talk about particular situations and countries and things. That's not really the point with the basic philosophical principles right now. But nonetheless, if you look at the history of Christendom, you will find that Christ is king, that the Catholic Church is the only religion that is established as the religion of the society. There may be other temples and things like that that are allowed for reasons of public peace, but they also wouldn't allow the promotion of those religions. And you know, nothing's really changed with liberalism. The myth of liberalism is this idea that, well, we're going to get rid of this notion that there's one religion that everyone has to follow. And again, no one's forced to follow the religion. That's not, you can't force someone to be Christian or Catholic. It can't be done through coercion. But liberalism has this myth that, you know, we're going to get rid of this, archaic idea that there's one true religion, and then all the religions will have their rights. That never really happens, does it? Because it's impossible for all religions to have rights, even if you think that there is not one true religion, because all societies have some basic moral code. You might say, well, I don't believe in the Ten Commandments, but at the same time in your society, you would say something like, you can't murder somebody. Well, there go the religions, like the Aztec human sacrifices. So really, not all religions have rights in all societies. Nobody believes that all religions have rights. If it were true that all religions had the right to do what they want, then how could a government say that the Muslim population can't establish a mosque right in front of the Parliament building or something like that? They could say, well, this is what God told us, to put the mosque right in front of the Parliament building. And the state might say, well, that's not allowed here. It's like, well, are you telling me that about my religion? You know, you can see how these things can be absurd. This is why there's no such thing as the freedom of religion. There isn't. There are certain societies that have decided to use that term, but really all societies, no matter what they are in a state of toleration of all religions. At least within a Catholic society, a society of Christendom, no one is pretending. We are not pretending that the other religions have any rights. We're saying that the rights are of the Catholic Church, and other religions will be tolerated if they follow the rules of the society, and they will not be able to promote their religions to other people. And the reason why you can't promote your false religion to somebody else is very simple. The same reason why you can't, I don't know, go around talking to, well, let's use an analogy again. You might say that, not you, but one may say that his society is secular and we don't instill religious values in our schools. That's a religious value. By having no religion taught to your students, you're teaching them about religion. You're saying that religion is secondary to mathematics. Again, there's no way around this. And again, I mean, there are many crazy people around today, but I think most people, even if they're atheists, would agree that, you know, it's probably not a good thing to go teach little kids that they're supposed to murder somebody else. Sorry for hitting my laptop there. And they'd say, well, that's obvious. Well, okay. But again, as Catholics, we have to believe that Christ tells us that we fear not him who can kill the body, but him who can kill the soul. So if we teach children false things about religion, we teach them things that are spiritually murderous, if you understand my meaning. So even this notion that, you know, you could have this panoply of religions taught in schools and things like this is irreconcilable with reason. It's irreconcilable with Catholic principles. It's a complete myth. And again, no one believes this. This is one thing I want to try to hammer home as we read through this book over the next series of episodes. There are, if I'm not mistaken, I want to say about 20 chapters. Well, there's more than that. I don't think we'll go through every single one. That would be a lot of episodes. But there are, otherwise I'd just be reading you an audiobook. Nonetheless, one of the things that I want to hammer home as we go through this is people who call themselves liberals are not liberals. Liberalism is impossible. A liberal must necessarily be a tyrant. And Archbishop Lefebvre talks about this in his book. Liberalism always becomes tyranny. And why? Because there is no objective basis for liberalism. You know, the liberal society that says, or the liberal philosopher that says, you know, no man can be coerced into, or no man is beholden to any religion, or no man can establish his religion, for example, or no man can censor anyone's speech. Those are impossible principles to live by. It's impossible to do that, and therefore when people transgress those principles because they're unreasonable, then they have to resort to coercion and tyranny and restriction and so forth to do so. They become the thing that they theoretically hate. And we saw this with, you know, with the COVID regime in our societies. We saw that these liberal regimes, these liberal governors and premiers and prime ministers and so forth, they easily became the most tyrannical people possible. Whereas the places that had the most quote-unquote right-wing, most, you know, Christian-leaning, most, you know, traditionally valued people, whether they were Catholics or not, tended to be the places that offered the most liberty, ironically. And this is one of the things, too, is that as Catholics, we do believe in a true liberty. We do believe that there is such thing as a true freedom. The freedom to do what you ought to do is a good and sacred thing. It's part of your free will. It's a necessary thing. But only those who are honest and clear about their principles, about what constitutes true freedom, true religion, true rights, and so forth, the rights of God primary, only in a situation like that will you have legitimate, real liberty. Chesterton said it like this. He said, you'll have 10 commandments or you'll have 10,000 commandments. Think about that for a second. He also said that you'll either have rules or you'll have rulers. If you think about a society, I'll give you an example. If you, one of our priests is from Switzerland, and he was talking about how in Switzerland you have the cantons, right, the little regions, which are very self-governing and so forth. It's kind of the best instantiation of the type of government we would call polity, which is one of the acceptable forms of government according to Aquinas and Aristotle and so forth. And he said there's a stark difference between the Protestant cantons and the Catholic cantons. So for example, in the Catholic cantons, they don't have strictness on drinking. They don't have many police patrolling the roads. They're not really worried about speed limits and so forth. But they also don't have any problems with those things. Whereas in the places that were formerly Puritan, think about Calvin's Geneva, for example, in the places that were formerly Puritan, they have a heavy police presence and a heavy sort of bylaw infraction enforcement presence, because people basically can only be, they can basically only act in it's harder for them to act in a way that is peaceful and civil than it is for those from the Catholic society. And why is that? Well, because in Protestantism, rules are all arbitrary, especially if you're in a type of determinist, predestinatory or double predestination. We do believe in predestination as Catholics in some sense, but if you're in the sort of parody of that or the error of that with the Calvinist perception, this notion that you must act right in life is a very arbitrary thing, and you basically have to be coerced to do it. Whereas in Catholicism, we understand that all of our actions, it is our faith and our works that saves us, and therefore, even the smallest thing that we do will be seen by God, and we may lose our soul because of it. And we think like that as Catholics, and we understand that all of our actions are part of the sanctification of our soul and so forth. And anyway, so you see in a society that has a Catholic moral compass, they actually don't have a very heavy regulatory system for their people, whereas you see for people that have an anti-Catholic spirit of their country, they have to have essentially a continual presence of coercive powers in order to make the people not become criminals. And this is just a theme that we see in liberal societies. You get rid of the oppressive rules of traditional morality, and you bring in the oppressors that oppress everyone who doesn't believe in liberalism. You see this. So I've kind of gone on a long time here, and I want to keep this under a half an hour. But we're going to go through this book by Archbishop Lefebvre, and we're going to go through all these things. I've just sort of been stream of consciousness talking about it here. So I encourage you to sign up, because we'll be doing a book study. They've Uncrowned him by Archbishop Lefebvre. I'll pull it up again on the screen here. Make sure you can see it. You can listen to the audiobook on YouTube, and it's also, I think it's sspxpodcast.com. You can see you have a window into my YouTube life. I was looking up some dumbbells, and there's a little nursery rhyme thing that my daughter watches sometimes. And then you can go to the website angeluspress.org, and you can buy it there. So we're going to be going through this. All right, check out the links in the description area for this if you want to sign up as a paid member. And we'll talk about this book at length, and it's going to be great. I can't wait to do it, and I'm excited to do this with you. So awesome. All right, this has been Mere Tradition with Kennedy Hall, and I will see you next time.